In the quiet suburbs of Long Island, New York, a nightmare was unfolding, hidden in plain sight. For over a decade, a brutal predator stalked the streets, leaving behind a trail of bodies that seemed to vanish without a trace, until they were found in the most chilling of places. Who was this killer and what drove them to murder? The case of the Long Island serial killer remains one of the most unsettling and mysterious in American history. Join me as we unravel the terror that gripped this community and the chilling enigma that still haunts us today. The story begins in 2010 when the discovery of a set of human remains along the Ocean Parkway on Long Island sparked the beginning of a grisly investigation. The bodies were found buried in burlap sacks, discarded like trash, and were quickly identified as victims of a serial killer. What made this case even more chilling was the pattern that began to emerge. The bodies were those of young women, mostly sex workers and escorts. The first victim, found in December 2010, was identified as Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old woman. Shannon had been working as an escort and had vanished after a 911 call in which she frantically claimed someone was trying to kill her. Despite her desperate cries, no one knew where she had gone, until her remains were discovered in the area. Her disappearance seemed like an isolated accident, but it soon became clear that something far darker was at play. In the following months, the investigation expanded. More bodies were found, dozens of remains, all linked by location, all pointing to the same terrifying truth: a serial killer was on the loose. As the bodies piled up, so did the questions. Who was the killer? Why did they target these women? And how had they managed to remain hidden for so long in a busy, populated area? The terror spread quickly throughout Long Island. Locals began locking their doors and keeping their children close. The thought that a killer could be living among them, stalking the very street they walked on, was enough to send shivers down everybody's spine. The police faced a growing mountain of evidence and very few solid leads. The case seemed almost impossible to crack. The victims were all women with ties to the sex trade, but they had no clear connection to each other. Investigators were working with little to go on, just a trail of bodies and the knowledge that the killer was lurking somewhere nearby. As the investigation dragged on, the fear only intensified. The police received tips from the public, but many of them led nowhere. In 2011, a break came when authorities identified the victims as not only being young women, but also being linked by a series of haunting characteristics. The killer seemed to have a ritualistic pattern. He would take his victims, often from the same areas along Ocean Parkway, and dispose of their bodies in nearly identical ways. As months passed without significant progress, many began to speculate about the identity of the killer. Was it someone familiar with the area? Perhaps even a local? The victims' bodies were found in remote locations that could only have been accessed by someone who knew the roads well. Investigators started to believe that the killer had spent years refining his method, lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But even with the theory, the police were no closer to catching him. In the background of the investigation, there was also the haunting fact that Shannon Gilbert's death, the initial lead in the case, was never fully understood. Was she murdered by the same person? Or was her death a tragic accident linked to her frantic escape from a dangerous situation? This lingering uncertainty only added to the confusion and terror. Years passed, and the killer identity remained a mystery. The Long Island serial killer, also referred to as the Gilgo Beach Killer, due to the location of some of the bodies, evaded capture despite extensive efforts by law enforcement. The case went cold, with little evidence and no clear suspects. The fear that once gripped Long Island seemed to subside, but the shadow of the killer's presence never truly disappeared. With each passing year, the case grew colder, and the community was left with only questions. Who was the Long Island serial killer? Was the killer still out there? Or had he moved on to a new hunting ground? Would the victims ever get justice? As of today, the case remains unsolved, and the killer's identity is still a mystery. Despite advancements in forensic technology and several promising leads over the years, the killer has never been caught. The investigation is ongoing, but with each year that passes, the likelihood of solving the case grows slimmer. The families of the victims, the community of Long Island, and the public are left to wonder if the killer will ever be brought to justice. The Long Island serial killer case stands as a chilling reminder of how a predator can lurk in the shadows for years, unnoticed and undetected, and how a community can be torn apart by fear and uncertainty. The horror of his case is not just in the brutal murders, but in the unanswered questions and the faces of the victims that still haunt the collective memory of Long Island. The Long Island serial killer's reign of terror may have ended, or may still be ongoing, but the victims' stories remain. The case remains a dark chapter in true crime history, one that leaves us all with a sense of unease and a lingering fear that somewhere out there, the killer is still hiding in plain sight. The mystery of who the Long Island serial killer is continues to haunt the lives of those who have been affected by this terrifying case.